marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This hour we're going to talk about God in your brain, and a lot of this has to do with what is called neuroscience. The sad reality is that most of the people working in the area of neuroscience, or what sometimes is even called neuroethics, really start from a materialistic point of view, which means that they're going to try to explain everything, including even religion, our belief in God, and those kinds of things, in terms of some kind of materialism, the idea that all you are is matter. And so you have individuals saying that your brain is nothing more than a meat computer, and you really don't have free will. You really think you're touching and making contact with God, but that really isn't taking place. And really what we are dealing with is what Richard Dawkins and others are saying, that DNA is using you to make more DNA, but there's really no meaning to life. There's no soul, there's no afterlife, and the rest. This is an important issue, and so from time to time, whether we've talked about the book The Spiritual Brain or neuroethics, a topic that I've addressed sometimes in some of the radio commentaries, we wanted to get to this new book called God and the Brain. It is written by Dr. Bradley Sickler, and it deals with this whole idea of what is happening in terms of brain science or cognitive science. He has his PhD from Purdue University as an associate professor of philosophy, and also the program director for the Master of Arts program in Theological Studies at the University of Northwestern. And Dr. Sickler, it's great to have you on the program today. Yes, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, that was the ideal introduction to my book. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, let's, if we can, talk about you browsing through a bookstore and looking at some of those issues of brain, because in some respects, that's why you felt the need to write a book that talks about the soul, the spirit, eternal issues, freedom, and a variety of others. Talk about how this came about, because most of the people that want to write in this field tend to be scientists, but you have kind of a philosophy background. So explain that, if you might.
I do. Well, and I have backgrounds in both. So my undergraduate degree was in physics, and then I went to seminary, and then and have been ordained and worked as a pastor, but also after that went to get my PhD in philosophy. So I've always been interested, since even before I understood what philosophy and theology really were, I've always been interested in those questions, especially where they overlap between science and Christianity. So like you said, sometimes the reason to write a book is because you keep hearing something that's bothering you, and you feel like somebody needs to address it. And that's really what happened with this book. I was hearing exactly the sort of thing you were talking about earlier, that we are meat machines, that we are just nothing but our brains. There is no spiritual dimension to our personhood. There's no life after death. There's no real reason to believe in God. It's a fluke of how evolution wired us. It's a survival adaptation and nothing more. And I wanted to address those things. So the bookstore incident you're talking about was one day I was standing in the bookstore, and I looked on the magazine rack, and there were three Popular Science, National Geographic, Scientific American. They all had a brain article and an image of a brain featured on their cover. And from my perspective, all three of them were missing something or addressing things improperly, and more importantly to me, addressing things in a way that I think undermines people's faith in the biblical account of what we call anthropology in theology or philosophy, and that is an account of what it is to be human.
Let's, if we can, at least set forward the Christian view, because that gets us into the idea that we have a soul, and certainly that, as you point out there, that then says that we were meant to know God. We were wired for morality. And so there are some things that we can identify, both from theology and through human experience and science, that show, if nothing else, the inadequacy of a materialistic or evolutionary worldview. True?
Totally true. The biblical teaching is that we are spiritual beings made to know God, and that's sort of the theme of what the book is trying to argue for and defend and respond to criticisms of. So as spiritual beings, we have a spiritual immaterial soul that is an integrated aspect of our personhood, but our body is not the sum totality of who we are. And that those depictions are really strongly at odds and have implications for all kinds of other worldview things, including especially Christology. So as you know, there's a growing trend to try to reduce humans to nothing but bodies, including in some Christian circles of theology and philosophy. And I find that especially troubling, partly for its implications about Christology. I don't think you can reduce Jesus himself as to just a body and still maintain that he is the God-man, that he is the Son of God with us, God in the flesh. The Son took on flesh. So really, to me, the anthropology centers on Christology, who Jesus was, and what the Scriptures testify about him as the second Adam, as the Spirit man made perfect, all those kinds of things. And if we extricate the Spirit out of the picture, we're left with a hollowed-out Jesus that is no longer God in the flesh and really can no longer, therefore, be our Redeemer.
Yes. Well, you know, one of the things that I've seen some Christians, even well-meaning Christians, do is when they see what they think is a conflict between science and the Bible, they say, well, then the Bible must be teaching science. And that kind of gets into your second chapter, because there have been a few conflicts, Galileo, Newton, and Darwin, to use the three that you use as examples. And sometimes well-meaning Christians have said, well, I guess that's what the Bible really meant. And some of those conflicts weren't as large a conflict as today some of our secular historians of science make them out to be. But it's also important that we make sure that we understand the scientific understanding carefully, but also that we do good exegesis of the Scriptures. True?
Absolutely. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a lot of fomenting of the conflict narrative that Christianity and science are really enemies, that they can't be compatible, and that sort of with every new scientific advance, Christianity has dealt a couple more body blows, and it's almost been eradicated. And you know, their hope was fairly soon it would disappear off the stage altogether, and we would just be left with nothing but naked science. And that is inaccurate for a variety of reasons. One of them, you know, you mentioned these historical events that I address in the book with Galileo and Newton. Take those two, for example. They were self-professing Christians. Mm-hmm. And the people that they were mostly interacting or arguing with were also claiming to be Christians. So it was never for them a faith-science conflict. Now, there were certain things that had to be re-understood. You know, when Psalm 96:10 says the world is firmly established, it cannot be moved, you know, the point of Copernicus and Galileo and others was to say, this is not an astronomy lesson. This is a teaching about God's sovereignty, so it's a mistaken application of Scriptures. So then it really was a hermeneutical issue, an interpretation question, not a question of which is right, science or Christianity. And a lot of them end up being just this sort of thing. And a lot of what we are often told is science, or what science is teaching us or showing us, really isn't the science at all. It's just how the person is interpreting what the science means. If I have time, I'll give you a quick example. Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Let's do that after the break, because we have one of those mandatory breaks, and we certainly want to hear that story. So we'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
America is currently in the midst of a contentious debate about whether to open the public schools and how to do it. Parents, teachers, and administrators have concerns about the risks and safety. Those are legitimate concerns that need to be addressed. But what needs to be called out are the actions of some of the teachers' unions. For most of us, the pandemic represents a public health problem. For many of the teachers' unions, it provides an opportunity to leverage state legislatures and put charter schools out of business. The editors of the Wall Street Journal say there's a phrase for that: political extortion. Another commentator called it educational blackmail. Give it the label you feel most appropriate. It's not a good look for educators. The American Federation of Teachers declared their support for safety strikes if local unions didn't approve of steps used in school districts to address the virus. Earlier this month, an alliance of teachers unions and progressive groups sponsored a national day of resistance and listed their demands before returning to the classroom. Most of the demands have little to do with education and can't even be addressed by school boards. They range from canceling rents and mortgages to passing Medicare for all to passing a wealth tax. A few demands do relate to schools, like implementing a moratorium on voucher programs and standardized tests, along with moving towards police-free schools. These teachers' unions also want a moratorium on charter schools and want governors and other political leaders to also close private schools. Public schools are funded whether they're open or not. Private and religious schools rely on tuition and donations. You know, many of these teachers' unions seem less interested in finding ways to open schools safely and more interested in threatening strikes to get their progressive wish list. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Bradley Sickler, author of the book God on the Brain. It is published by Crossway. The book came out last month, and we have information about it. If you'd like to get it in paperback or Kindle, might be able to find it in your local bookstore. And we can certainly talk about some of the critics of Christianity and of the idea of the soul, whether it's Richard Dawkins in the biology area, or we can talk about Steven Pinker in the psychological area. But Dr. Sickler, you talked about a story from Neil deGrasse Tyson, astrophysicist, and really a critic of Christianity and of faith from a kind of physics point of view. But tell us that story, if you might.
Well, he's a good example of not understanding what the science says versus what the interpretation is, and people absorbing things because they're said by a scientist and then thinking, therefore, that's what the science says. He was just talking about how large the cosmos is and saying it used to be that people thought it was just this tiny little cosmos and therefore we were the most important things in it, but now we know the cosmos is mind-bogglingly huge, so we don't matter and it's trying to kill us. And, you know, that clearly just doesn't follow. People have always known the cosmos was big. If you look at it in a different way, you might say, well, humans are even more special than we thought. And all this huge, 20 billion light-year wide cosmos, we're the only things that we know of that have this investigative nature, that have a spiritual component, that have moral beliefs and things like that. We don't know of anything else anywhere that's like that. We're even more special than we thought. So a lot of it is how you look at things. And the facts themselves are often misunderstood or skewed or presented in such a way that it looks like it's science, but really what's being done is an entire worldview is being smuggled in and passed off as data.
Yes. And again, I think Psalm 8 might answer the question of Neil deGrasse Tyson, but nevertheless, it gets us back to some of the others. And that is, you really try to help us understand how science and Christianity aren't necessarily enemies. They could be partners. And that gets us into some of the things you talk about in terms of natural theology and a theology of nature. Can you explain that?
Sure. Natural theology is the project of trying to look at nature and derive from that conclusions about God. For example, the cosmological argument says, things don't begin without being caused, and the cosmos begin, therefore it must have had a cause. Or the design argument would look at the intricacy and complexity of things, living things, for example, and say the probability of this happening randomly is so vanishingly small that can't be a good explanation. Or the fine-tuning of the fundamental constants of nature and say, it's so improbable that those would be just so in order to give us a stable universe we could live in. That can't be a good explanation. A theology of nature is a little different. It's really reflecting back on nature through a theological lens instead of trying to establish theological conclusions from an investigation of nature, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So we take the things we know. For example, we know that in Christ all things hold together. We know that in God we live and move and have our being. We know that he upholds all things by his powerful word. So we think about that sustaining, creative, constant, ongoing work of God. I'm working and my Father is always working as well. And then we think, okay, what does nature, how do we understand nature through that theological lens that at every moment it's being sustained and, as it were, recreated by God? So that's an example of doing theology in reflection of what we, or thinking about nature in reflection of what we learn from theology.
So again, some of the early chapters kind of deal with this issue of science and Christianity, whether they're enemies or partners, and how to think about this, and maybe even some of the if you will, ginned up conflicts that I don't think necessarily exist. So those are certainly the case. But since we mentioned Darwin, that kind of gets us into the chapter you also talk about in terms of evolutionary explanations for belief in God. Because our atheist friends, especially the so-called new atheists, they've got a problem. And the problem is this: we are an incredibly religious culture. We have an incredibly religious world. I mean, there are at least in round numbers, about 2 billion people in this world that claim to be Christians. Now, they're not all born-again Christians, but they, in one way or another, believe that. There's about 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, not all of them faithfully adhering to the 5 pillars of Islam, but that is the case. You have another billion probably that fit into the category of Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hinduism. Add to that animism, various other kinds of cults, religions, and things like that. We're an incredibly religious civilization and species, if you will, using an evolutionary point of view. And so, Dr. Sickler, one of the problems that our atheist friends have is that they believe that God is just a concept that has been perpetuated by those religious people like you and me, but they still have to kind of come to grips with that. So they kind of say, if it weren't for you guys teaching about religion, then atheism would be the default value, the default setting, if you will. And so in some respects, evolution has to come up with some kind of explanation for why so many people believe in God, if you accept the evolutionary point of view that all we are is a biological product of evolution.
That's right. I mean, put yourself in the evolutionary naturalist's shoes for a minute. You have a very limited toolbox. You've essentially only got 2 tools in your toolbox. You've got mutations, and you've got natural selection or selection pressure. Now, with those 2 tools, you have to build everything about human nature. Not just the fact that we have teeth or that we have a circulatory system or something like that. You have to build in how we come to have our memory, how we're able to reason reliably, how we come to have reliable sensations about the world around us. But even more so, then you have to address our ability, our propensity to think about deeper questions. including what is the nature of science itself. But then these other things, these what we call religious beliefs, three in particular, are by any definition natural. People believe in God or gods. People believe that they have a soul, and people believe in the survival of the soul after the death of the body. These are natural beliefs. So this is where cognitive science of religion comes in, and it says these beliefs are entirely natural. They are widespread. They occur, contradictory to what the atheists would say. They actually occur even in children who are not educated into any kind of religious system.
Right.
So they're there. They are the default setting. They have the story completely backwards. The
Yes.
default setting is for people to have religious propensities, in those three categories particularly. So what has to happen is you have to sort of beat it out of them, or browbeat it out of them, or intimidate it out of them. I mean, you can remove these religious tendencies, but they're sort of the natural setting. So that, again, presents a real challenge. How, given the general reliability that we think all of these processes and mechanisms have, how did it get things so wrong, according to the naturalist, when it comes to these beliefs? How is it that we were led so far from the true state of affairs into these massive deceptions that we are not, we're not spiritual beings. There are no spirit beings or gods or any other things like that. There's no creator. There's no life after death. I mean, we've got it massively wrong, and it's natural that we do. And as you were saying, it's widespread, not just today. You gave those numbers for today. Even in our modern scientific advanced era, those numbers are still that high. And it's certainly been that case throughout history as well. So that's a real chestnut for them to have to crack with only those two tools in their toolbox.
Well said. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some more. But for those of you that have studied this, I might point out that there was an individual by the name of Dean Hammer. We've quoted him before in terms of homosexuality issues, but he wrote the book, The God Gene, and he made the argument that some people are more religious than others because they have one DNA letter that is different from non-religious people. And that story didn't go very far. Well, it did in the media because people not looking at it from a scientific point of view thought that was kind of interesting. But the experiments that he did were not well defined. No one could replicate them. And so that's one of the few attempts to try to answer that question by still using some of those tools in that toolbox. But when we come back, we want to move on to some of those issues, because what does it mean if everything is a brain state? In other words, if all you are is reacting to your meat computer, I mean, do you have free will? Can you really believe in love? What does it mean if you start doing away with the concept of the soul? And then what about this idea of the mind-body? How does that all fit together? And we'll get into dualism and the question of freedom, reason, science, morality. Just a fascinating book, and it came out this last month, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but since sometimes you have difficulty, we also have a link so that you can get it both in paperback and in Kindle. It's published by our friends at Crossway, and we'll continue our conversation about God on the Brain right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about this new book, God on the Brain. Dr. Bradley Sickler with us, and we're focusing on what I think is a great challenge. Why are we talking about this? In many ways, evolution for more than a century has been a challenge to Christianity, and I think there has been very good answers given to that and arguments for intelligent design, and we can go on and on. But I think one of the great challenges now in the 21st century has been neurophysiology, because our friends ones that are materialist or evolutionist basically want to say that what you think is the mind is really just your brain, and what you think is freedom is really completely determined, and what you think is a conversation that you're having with God is just your brain states interacting with each other. So, Dr. Sickler, one of the things that I sometimes run into is they'll say, well, prove to me that there's a mind and a brain. And I say, well, we can go all the way back to Wilder Penfield back in the 1960s. I can take you all the way up to some of the new research. But I turn it around on them pretty quickly, and that gets us into Chapter 5. Because in some respects, I say, you have a lot more to prove. And because, as you said, you've only got this toolbox that has mutation and natural selection, and you have to now explain everything from this sense of a consciousness that seems to be different than our brain. You have to explain everything from freedom, free will. You have to explain things like visions and dreams and even religious experiences. You have to explain every bit of that with your limited number of tools. And as you begin to ask, is everything just brain states?
Well, I don't think that's a very hopeful project, as you know from looking at the book. The propensity to reduce things really runs all through the various sciences. And what they want to do is to say, to really explain something, you've got to eliminate everything that can even possibly theoretically be done without. And sometimes you're going to have to pay a really high price to do that. And when it comes to anthropology, to what it is to be human, you see that same tendency that you see in many other branches of science. We're going to get rid of the soul. We no longer need it. We no longer need anything but the brain, maybe a few more elements of the central nervous system, but certainly not a soul or spirit. But as you were saying, what that leaves you with is, first of all, the challenges to freedom and things like that, but also how we got from being purely material beings to having such a widespread religious propensity. So if you look at the accounts they give, again, using only those toolboxes, you're going to have to say, especially, what is adaptive or beneficial about being religious or about having religious beliefs, belief in God, souls, and immortality in particular. And they have to try to make the case that somehow or other these things ended up conferring a survival advantage, either directly or indirectly. So maybe they confer a survival advantage directly by enabling people to trust each other more because they share these religious bonds, or sexual signaling to a potential mate that you are going to be faithful and remain to raise the family because you're religious, and that usually involves commitments and costly signaling by sacrifices and things like that. Or maybe it's indirect, and we have, like Stuart Guthrie's Faces in the Clouds, we have an anthropomorphism tendency to see things that aren't there, or maybe Daniel Dennett, a hyperactive kind of super awareness of our surroundings that implies there's danger, even if there isn't, just to be on the safe side, or what Justin Barrett called a hyperactive agency detection device. So one way or another, you're going to have to do that. But again, there's a big question just for the science of those accounts, which is, why do those persist when they are so far from the truth if the materialist, naturalist perspective is right? It seems like you could get those things at a much cheaper price without all the metaphysical baggage.
That's right.
So that's a real question just for the cognitive science of it. And as far as the neuroscience, yeah, they want to reduce religious experiences, whether it's dramatic things like dreams and visions, or whether it's simple daily things like feeling the conviction of the Holy Spirit or a prompting to share the gospel with somebody or something like that. They have to reduce all of that to brain states, and then, I think, have to face the larger task, which they aren't up to, of saying, and that's the end of the story. Because the Christian perspective on all of this stuff is to accept the science and to be able to say, yes, those things are going on in the brain, but to say they're going on because God is actually at work. He really is revealing himself. He really is prompting you, leading you, convicting you. And furthermore, we have these natural beliefs that are so widespread and pervasive because they're veridical. There really is a God. We really do have souls. There really is life after death. So the more natural approach is, I think, to take the explanation that covers all the data and then provides it also fits seamlessly into an overall more satisfying worldview. But as you were pointing out, if your worldview means you have to give up believing that we have freedom, you have to give up believing that our cognitive processes and faculties are generally reliable. That's a really high price to pay, and you don't have to pay it in order to accept the science.
And the other part of that, this now moves into apologetics. Most people don't live that way either. You have individuals that say, I'm just completely programmed by my meat computer in my brain, and that is it. And yet then they go and make choices and act as if individuals have worth and dignity and value. They act as if you are a mind making decisions on the facts that are presented to your brain. And they live in a world and even in a society that says we're going to punish you for wrongdoing because you should have an understanding of right and wrong. You start thinking about all the things. Of course, I'm stealing a little bit from Chapter 8 and some things we've talked about on the program before. Not only is it a high price to pay, I just don't see even these rank materialists living consistently within that worldview. How about you?
Oh, it's unlivable. I mean, who could live like that? Who could really walk around believing, as Sam Harris proclaims, that he or she is a biomechanical puppet? That's his word for it. Who could walk around believing that? We deliberate about things all the time. We expect other people to do the same. We reward and praise people who make difficult decisions and follow through with their obligations, things like that. And we do. We discipline or punish or restrain in various ways people who don't. And we treat everybody as if they have real agency. And not only that, as if there is a real moral law that they are either abiding by or transgressing. And if the naturalist reductionist approach to humanity is right, you've got another issue that we haven't talked about much. In addition to the God, souls, and immortality stuff, you've got another issue, which is to explain human moral behavior,
yes,
which, again, has this common universal core. And many people have probably read C.S. Lewis's wonderful classic treatment of this. He calls it the Tao, and he goes through all these religious and other cultural traditions and says, these things really are common and universal. There are rules everywhere about protecting life and when killing is permissible and when it's prohibited. There are rules about sexual behavior. There are rules about duties to parents and children. And these are truly universal. The particulars might vary, but general guidelines about those topics are found everywhere, in every culture, everywhere. But the naturalist who only has those two tools in their toolbox is going to have to say, there's nothing transcendent going on. There's nothing above and beyond matter in motion, material moving around, genes replicating themselves through all these illusions. And there really isn't anything objectively wrong about, killing your neighbor, raping his wife, and stealing his stuff, as opposed to something objectively right about loving your neighbor and treating them with equal dignity to your own. The most they can ever do, and as you say, I deal with this in a later chapter more extensively, but the most they can ever do is to say, that's how nature has wired us. That's how the evolutionary processes have inclined us. And that's it. That's all you can say is, at the end of the day, you can say, well, I don't like it. But you can never say there's something really, truly, objectively wrong about it. And this, too, is where the gospel is at stake, really, because if there isn't any objective thing, such as sin, then there certainly isn't an objective sin problem, and therefore there's no solution for Jesus, there's no problem for Jesus to be offering a solution to.
Yes. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, of course, we've taken a little bit out of some of the chapters on morality and freedom, but maybe a question that's come into your mind is, well, then how does a mind or a soul interact with a body? And that is a very good question, and it's a perennial one that has surfaced in the past, long before we had neurophysiology, so we'll talk about that. And if you would like to know more about this book, we have information at our website, pointofview.net. It's entitled God on the Brain. Dr. Bradley Sickler with us, and we'll continue our conversation with him right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking about the book God on the Brain. Dr. Bradley Sickler with us, and of course this gets us into the question of dualism, and in particular, how do we see an interaction between the mind and the brain, or the soul and the body? And I recognize that is a really big question because it takes us into our biblical anthropology, really even takes us into our biblical eschatology. But you're a professor used to teaching students, so help us out, because one of the criticisms that comes is that you guys are saying that something is material and something is immaterial. How can those even interact with one another? Can you answer that question for us in a brief amount of time?
Well, that's a challenge, isn't it? Yeah, you've clearly dealt with this subject before. The interaction problem is what you're stating, and I do deal with that in the book, and I have a lot more to say about it in the book, along with some other objections to mind-body or soul-body interaction that get more complicated. But the basic question is, how could a material and immaterial thing interact? And I guess my response to that is one that I learned from a former professor of mine, and he said, what's the problem? They do interact, and if you're asking for a mechanism, what is the mechanism of their interaction? That's really not even appropriate to ask for, because mechanisms are for material things. So there isn't any kind of mechanism. But as there are different models of minds or souls and bodies and how they interact, but we don't want to think of it the way Plato tended to, which is, his analogies were as a hand in a glove, or as a carpenter uses a tool or a musician uses an instrument. That makes a separation between the mind or the spirit and the body that I think is more of a break than the biblical picture would warrant. So I prefer a more integrative dualism kind of approach, which has also been around for many centuries. I mean, Descartes was often, I think, misunderstood on this point. And he said that the mind and the body are so closely intermingled as to essentially form a unit or a single thing. And a lot of the medievals thought of it this way too.
Right.
That while they are separable and separate substances, first of all, they are integrated into a single unity, right? You are that unity. But secondly, their interaction is mysterious. But here's why that doesn't bother me. I mean, first of all, I'm a philosopher, so I'm used to a lot of ambiguity and mystery.
Of course.
But as a physics major, so I have a physics degree, and I came to see that we really don't understand how anything interacts. And especially in modern physics in the 20th century.
Especially in the quantum world, yeah.
Yeah, in the quantum world, there's all kinds of bizarre, spooky, incomprehensible stuff going on. Particles interacting with each other even though they're too far apart to communicate. Things tunneling through barriers that they don't actually have the energy to go through. So it would be like me jumping over the Sears Tower. Once in a while I make it. I mean, there are all kinds of strange things, but even something as simple as gravity, to go back to Newton, Newton was asked how gravity was promulgated or how it, connected these two bodies. And he said, I don't know, but it clearly does, right? And if we want to take a more modern Einsteinian view of it and talk about space-time and its distortions, that still doesn't really explain anything. For example, it doesn't explain why mass distorts the fabric of space-time. It also introduces a new entity, space-time, and treats it as if it's a big trampoline or something. So, I mean, at the fundamental level, why do electrons repel each other? Why do opposite charges attract each other? How is gravity taking place? How does all this quantum entanglement work? Our answer is, for all of those things, we don't know, but we can describe it. We can describe what's happening, and we can model it and make predictions on it. So I'm perfectly content to say I don't know exactly the means of interaction between mind and body, but it brings me back to that theological point I was making earlier. As we reflect on nature through a theological lens, God is the creator and sustainer, and everything that happens in every moment, moment by moment, even to the smallest scale of Planck moments or whatever the smallest division of time can be, God is at work creating, recreating, sustaining, upholding. And so all of those interactions are ultimately the outworking of his creative activity anyway. So all we're doing really in any scientific explanation is modeling what God is doing in his role as creator and sustainer of all things.
Let's just, before we run out of time, just talk about how people can maybe benefit from this book. J.P. Moreland is one of the people that really endorses it. And, of course, he's been on the program with us many times before talking about some of the brain issues and mind-brain. And it does seem to me that you wrote this in part because you have run into a couple of issues, the so-called conflict between science and religion, or science and Christianity. Also, the idea that, indeed, we have neurophysiologists today that have said we can eliminate the idea of the soul, eliminate the idea of the mind, eliminate the idea of eternal life, eliminate the idea of God, because all of those are brain states. So in some respects, you wrote the book to really be, if you will, kind of an apologetic and an answer to some of the questions being surfaced right now, because people are doing brain scans and making assumptions and coming to conclusions far beyond what the data really allows.
It's really gratifying to hear you put it that way, because that's exactly right. And everything that I do in terms of my scholarship has that apologetic backbone to it. I want people to understand their faith better if they're believers, and to be able to engage intelligently with unbelievers who oftentimes do have good and difficult questions. So for us to be engaging with them, it's also for unbelievers hoping that they might read this and think, oh, maybe the Christian perspective on things is more reasonable than I gave it credit for. Maybe there isn't this conflict that I've always been told there is. Maybe these guys aren't just a bunch of dummies. So everything that I do, I want to glorify God. I want to point people to Christ, and I want to, as Jesus said, feed my sheep so that people are just maybe a little bit better equipped to think through their faith and present it to others.
Well, again, the way the book is written, 10 chapters, 200 pages, it is one that certainly will feed your soul, but I think it could be used in an evangelistic way. So if you've got a friend, a neighbor, a coworker, maybe a family member that says, oh, I really just believe the science and I don't really believe all this religious stuff, this might be a book to put in their hands and see if it might have an impact. So, Dr. Bradley Sickler, it has been great to have you on the program, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We are going to take a break, and let me just mention that we have a number of resources that we always post on the website. And if you go back, you can type in some words like brain or God or soul, and you might find some other interviews that we've done on some of these issues, and I think that will be helpful to you. But if you have just joined us or did not get all the information, the book is entitled God on the Brain. Subtitle, What Cognitive Science Does and Does Not Tell Us About Faith, Human Nature, and the Divine. 10 chapters, 200 pages, a pretty good set of footnotes at the bottom of the page, as well as an index that will help you find some other issues. Now, there are some scriptural indexes as well, so if I hand it to a Christian, say, look, you don't have to accept all the Christian comments here or all the Bible verses, but by and large, it really does try to take on some of these science issues, which I think is one of the great challenges for us today in the 21st century. So that's why we did that today here on Point of View. Going to need to take a break, but I wanted you to be well aware of this book. It is published by Crossway. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have lots of information for it right on our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll have more right after this.
"2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kirby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we are so grateful that you are with us. And over the next couple of hours, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about second day of the Republican National Convention. We'll do that later this hour and a little bit next hour. And then we're going to spend some time talking about a couple of books and resources that will be very helpful to you. One of those, which we're going to focus on right now, is Reclaimed: How Jesus Restores Our Humanity in a Dehumanized World. During this political season, we can certainly see how polarized everything has been on the political realm. Of course, if you listen to Point of View any length of time, you know how polarized it can sometimes be in the area of religion. And so that is the case. And so even though we sometimes talk about tolerance, or we use the word civility, which I think is much more closer to the biblical concept, I think it is going to be really important for us to be able to look past our differences and recognize our common humanity. So that's one of the things we're going to focus on today, but also really understand what it means to be a human being and a biblical view of human beings. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. Then, as I said, we'll look a little bit later at what took place last night at the Republican National Convention, Day 2. Then we'll get into some other issues in the news about the pandemic and a number of other topics in the second hour, and finish off with a very good discussion of addiction. That book, Hope in the Age of Addiction, parallels some of the things that the First Lady spoke about last night. So these will be two books, and in between we'll have a chance to talk about some of the things that have been taking place in the political realm. Let me welcome, first of all, to the microphone, Andy Steiger, who is the founder and president of Apologetics Canada. The book is entitled Reclaimed: How Jesus Restores Our Humanity in a Dehumanized World. It is actually, interestingly enough, was something that related to the Human Project video series, and we'll talk about that with him in just a minute. And of course, he's also created what is called the Thinking series, author of the book Thinking: Answering Life's 5 Biggest Questions. He is an individual that has been speaking on various churches, campuses, universities, all sorts of things, currently as a PhD candidate, finishing off his doctoral degree at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and joins us now by phone from Portland, Oregon. So, Andy, thank you for joining us today.
It is great to be with you. I'm actually joining you from Vancouver, British Columbia today.
Well, that's okay. Oh, that's right. You live in British Columbia. My mistake. You originally lived in Portland, and I was going to talk about that in terms of the conflict. Fortunately, up there, you're not dealing with some of the things in Portland. I'm going to be flying in there next month, so I know what I'm going to run into, and you know what I'm talking about. So we will be talking about that certainly later. But whether it's up in Canada or in Portland, or whether it's in a variety of other places right now, there is a great deal of conflict. And one of the things I loved about your book is it has kind of a who's who of recommendations from people that have been on the program. Lee Strobel and Sean McDowell, J. Warner Wallace, of course, been with us, Paul Chamberlain, Craig Hazen, as well as Paul Copan and others. And they all endorse the book because they feel that there is a real need to begin to come back to understanding who we are as human beings, and to make sure that in the midst of all of this conflict, that we don't minimize the humanity of another individual. Tell us more, if you might.
Yeah, I think that this is the real challenge, especially these days with how politicized everything has been. But we can see this in a variety of different ways, that we lose sight of people and we begin to reduce them to all sorts of other things, whether that be a skin color or their maybe it's a physical challenge that they have, or it's a political view. And in doing so, in reducing them to those other things, and dehumanization is seen as reducing a person either to an object or an animal, we lose sight of the human being. And when that happens, we see historically, we see it currently, that we will mistreat them. We will treat them in horrendous ways, ways that we would normally never treat a human being.
Yes. And I loved how you opened, because I do know you're from Canada, but I'd kind of forgotten that that's where this took place. You had that opportunity to go out there in the middle of British Columbia, where they have the zombie walk, and you end up with people that are zombies being preached at by a street preacher, and both sides kind of not understanding the other side. But it is, I think, it's illustrative of the fact that whether you believe that other peoples are zombies, or whether you believe that other people are meat computers, as we were talking about last hour, and don't really have a humanity of sorts, it has become even easier in our politicized world, and what you also talk about in our digital world, to deny the humanity of another individual. And that's why I think we have so much conflict today.
Oh, and it's concerning. I mean, one of the examples that I give in the book is that I was, and this is ironic, I was asked to speak at a local high school here on the topic of genocide, as that's now a core curriculum here in British Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
And when so I agreed to come to this grade 12 class to talk on the topic of genocide, but I released a podcast shortly before, the day before it was to happen, in which I was listening to somebody's view. And a person took to Facebook. They didn't have somebody that attended that school. They didn't have any. They didn't even know me. They didn't even spell my name correctly on Facebook, and they just said whatever they wanted to say about me. They stereotyped me. They used the normal rhetoric that we hear today, whether that be a bigot or a brainwasher or whatever it might be. And interestingly, within 15 minutes, that school was threatened with a lawsuit. The teacher's job was threatened, and I was labeled unsafe and uninvited. And that was just, for me, one of those moments where I began to realize that, these concepts aren't things that just happened in the past, whether this be with slavery or this was with genocides of different types. This kind of stuff's happening right now, and we're particularly seeing this in the digital realm, where it's become so easy to lose sight of another human being.
Well, and some of that, of course, gets into the work that you've done in the Human Project, but I'll carry that out for just a minute before we get back to that. We have seen how in the past it has been obviously very common to minimize the humanity of others. We saw that, of course, in World War II, Nazis referring to Jews in terrible ways, Japanese calling Chinese very horrible things. I did a commentary a while back on how can you even understand the Rwandan genocide without the Hutus and the Tutsis and the way they interacted with one another. And so in some respects, we are seeing in our modern world things that we've seen in the past, and it's not good. So we come back from the break. I want you to talk a little bit more about the Human Project and then how this book fits into that, and what could be some of the great resources that would be available to some of our listeners. So let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation today with Andy Steiger, and again, an individual that is the founder and president of Apologetics Canada. And if you'd like to know more about him, we have a very good link to not only this book, which is now out, but to the website itself. And unlike that person that did not know how to spell his name, we have his name spelled correctly, and it goes to his website. And this book coming out next month is one that we wanted you to know about, and so that's why we're talking about it today here on Point of View. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
America is currently in the midst of a contentious debate about whether to open the public schools and how to do it. Parents, teachers, and administrators have concerns about the risks and safety. Those are legitimate concerns that need to be addressed. But what needs to be called out are the actions of some of the teachers' unions. For most of us, the pandemic represents a public health problem. For many of the teachers' unions, it provides an opportunity to leverage state legislatures and put charter schools out of business. The editors of the Wall Street Journal say there's a phrase for that: political extortion. Another commentator called it educational blackmail. Give it the label you feel most appropriate. It's not a good look for educators. The American Federation of Teachers declared their support for safety strikes if local unions didn't approve of steps used in school districts to address the virus. Earlier this month, an alliance of teachers unions and progressive groups sponsored a national day of resistance and listed their demands before returning to the classroom. Most of the demands have little to do with education and can't even be addressed by school boards. They range from canceling rents and mortgages to passing Medicare for all to passing a wealth tax. A few demands do relate to schools, like implementing a moratorium on voucher programs and standardized tests, along with moving towards police-free schools. These teachers' unions also want a moratorium on charter schools and want governors and other political leaders to also close private schools. Public schools are funded whether they're open or not. Private and religious schools rely on tuition and donations. You know, many of these teachers' unions seem less interested in finding ways to open schools safely and more interested in threatening strikes to get their progressive wish list. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Andy Steiger. I might just mention his book is coming out next week, September 1st. And so if you would like to order a copy, published by Zondervan, and we have information about it, so you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. And I think you will benefit from this in light of the politicized culture that we find ourselves in. Andy, let's talk for just a minute about the Human Project, because in some respects, this book fits very well with some of the things that you've done on that video series.
Yeah, I worked with Campus Crusade for Christ. They're called Power to Change here in Canada, and or Crew. We worked with them to film this series. We filmed in places like Uganda, in Korea, Ottawa, and we filmed in Portland, Oregon. And the idea behind the Human Project is, listen, we're well aware of what dehumanization is and the dangers of dehumanization. We've seen that. The question that's really not being addressed is, what exactly, though, is humanization? What is it? What is a human being? And so the Human Project really was to raise that question. And I'm proud to say that it was selected in a number of film festivals and, in fact, won People's Choice Award and also won Best Short Film. So it did very well and is a great resource that can be used in a church setting or a youth group setting, a community group or whatnot, to be able to have this important discussion, being able to identify dehumanization, but more so from a theological, biblical standpoint, what is a human being?
Yes. And again, the first part is what is human? Then the second, what is the value of human life? Number 3, what leads to human flourishing? And then part 4, how should humans live? And almost a 200-page book that gets into some of these aspects of this. And really what you're doing is fighting against a culture that says, look, you're just a product of blind chance, mass energy, chance, and time, the evolutionary product. And so human beings are nothing different than the animals that are around you. And as a result, we shouldn't necessarily take them any more seriously. We should maybe see them as just part of the natural environment. And if you start with a different assumption that says that we are created in God's image, we have value and dignity, whether we're rich or poor, whether we live in North America or whether we live in Africa, whether we are very intelligent or not so smart, that is just such a countercultural idea now, given the kind of secular, materialistic view of the world. And that's really, in some respects, what you're trying to do, bring people back to the idea that if you want any kind of human flourishing or any kind of respect of human beings, you really need to come back to some of those basic foundational principles, right?
Absolutely. And this is something that culture is aware of. Like when we came out of World War II, we understood that, a lot of what took place, and I particularly think of, say, eugenics, which is a Greek word meaning well-born,
right,
and in the sort of dehumanization that was done through that, we knew that this was a problem. And so you see right after World War II, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which we're all familiar with, that humans have inherent dignity, equality, and inalienable rights. The challenge is, how do you substantiate that on a secular worldview?
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge is you don't. As you were mentioning, it begins to collapse. And in particular, you see that with such things as, say, evolution as an example. You can have in a Darwinian viewpoint, you can see that some people are stronger than others. This idea that some are more well-born than others, that some have greater genetic, adaptions from whether it be fighting cancer or playing basketball. And the question becomes, though, is, well, where is the equality in all of this? And one of the things that really fascinated me, Kirby, is when you look historically at this, when Christians were initially having this or challenging this Darwinian viewpoint, and I think about the Monkey Scopes trial, that this was one of the key issues that was a part of it. And we've really lost sight of this. Eugenics was one of the major concerns, and because added to the fact that it was being taught in the school system, that has been completely lost historically. And yet, this is a conversation that's still taking place, and you can see so in very popular books by such people as Noah Harari and others. And as Christians, we've got to understand this conversation, particularly with where it's heading when we see things like transhumanism and other aspects of this philosophy being teased out.
One of the things I love about your book is it parallels something we have on our website right now. Chapter 5, you talk about the tale of two countries. And the video that we have right now at pointofview.net is called Korean Lights. And what we do is talk about the fact that North Korea and South Korea were all together at one time. So they have the same common cultural experience until North Korea was separated from South Korea. And we then show a picture at night and how there's darkness in North Korea and there's light in South Korea. And not only is that true in terms of power and energy and light, it's also true in terms of spiritual issues as well. And you talk about this tale of two countries, the difference between North Korea and South Korea. And again, it shows the difference of worldviews, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. I think it's an incredible visual representation of worldviews and the implications of worldviews. And I think that this is one of the key ideas that we really need to understand, is the way that you see a person will affect the way that you treat a person.
And so, again, that's an important part. Let's talk about some of the resources, because we have a link to your website, and I would like our listeners who either travel to Canada, maybe some of our listeners right now are in Canada, or maybe they're near some of the border where they could interact with you. You've got some great opportunities for people to know of some of the work that you're doing there. Plus, I might just point out that you've got some really interesting podcasts, some of the most recent ones, Parenting in a Technological Age. So talk about some of the resources that people can find when they go to your website, or even click on the link to apologeticscanada.com, because that will then take them into the Thinking series, the Human Project, and even the Human Project for Kids. And I wanted to do what I could to our national audience to help them know a little bit more about what you're doing up there in Canada.
I really appreciate that. As I'm sure listeners are aware, the word apologetics is from the Greek word apologia. It means to give an answer or a reason, and particularly as we see in the Bible, for the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. And so that's the work that we do. It's our prayer that people have hope and that they have good reason for the hope that they have in Jesus. We work with churches across Canada to do that work, and we believe in the church and seek to help the church. And one of the ways that we do that is creating resources that we believe are much needed in the culture today. And so, one example, you brought up the Human Project for Kids. That's one area where we've seen that there's just a deficit there. There's a need for the conversation about what we are as human beings and be able to speak that conversation at the youngest level and at the oldest. And so that's our goal in the resources that you'll see. And as well, just to have these important cultural conversations and to do so with gentleness and respect.
Well, again, I would encourage people to find out a little bit more about what you're doing. And having lived in Vancouver, BC for part of a summer, having spoken in the Fraser Valley, I'm aware of where you are and where you and your co-author are. But again, some great resources. And so if people would like to begin to interact with you, to support your ministry, maybe sign on to the podcast, what do they need to do?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Really, all they need to do is take a look. If you want to see our ministry, it's apologeticscanada.com. If you'd like to know more about the book, it's just reclaimedbook.info. But really, if you go to apologeticscanada.com, it will have the links to all the various resources that we have, including that podcast, which is the Apologetics Canada podcast.
Well, again, just some great resources. And let me mention again that just kind of a who's who of people we've had on the program: Lee Strobel and George Yancey and Sean McDowell and J. Warner Wallace and Andy Bannister and Craig Hazen, as well as Paul Chamberlain, Paul Cope. A number of those individuals have been on the program, and they all endorsed the book. And so just before the book came out, wanted to give it a little bit of a push. And so you can go to the website right now that we have, or you can, of course, go to Andy's website and pre-order the book, and that would certainly increase sales and probably get a lot of people's attention. And if there's anything we need right now in this polarized culture, it is to stop treating our fellow human beings created in God's image in any other way than individuals that are image bearers. So, Andy, thank you so very much for the work you're doing in apologetics, and we look forward maybe the next time when we can get into some of these details and a greater opportunity.
I really appreciate it, Kirby. Thank you for your time.
Let's take a break. I know many of you want to hear some of the thoughts about what happened at the Republican National Convention. We will focus on that now for a while. And then we'll get into, before the end of the next hour, the whole issue of addiction. That was something that was brought up last night by the First Lady. So we're going to talk about that, and a new book out that I think will be helpful to you in that regard. So let's take a break. And when we come back, a number of things that took place in night 2 of the Republican National Convention, maybe a few takeaways from the convention so far. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Second night of the Republican National Convention last night. I'll give you just a couple of the highlights in case you watched it, and perhaps you did not. Again, as we have said, both with the Democratic National Convention, and it's true also of the Republican National Convention, not as many people are watching it, but maybe you were one of, was it about 15 million people that did? So maybe you saw it, maybe you did not. But it again came down to something very interesting. And that is the focus in large part at the Democratic Convention was to highlight some of these notables. And of course, when you have former presidents, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, you have a variety of other individuals like John Kerry and others that show up, then you're going to have these high visible individuals. Not that there weren't some of those in the last two nights at the Republican Convention, but I still think some of the most powerful stories come from people you probably didn't know anything about. Let me pick two right off the top of my head. One of those is John Ponder. I heard about it and had to go back and watch a YouTube video to get the whole context. But here is an individual who is a former gang member. He was also a bank robber. He goes to prison, and there he discovers God. Actually discovers Christ. He hears Billy Graham over the radio and becomes a Christian. And so he then, when he gets out, actually founded what's called Hope for Prisoners. Now, the FBI agent who actually put him into prison had followed him and actually who had arrested him and eventually helped him in a reentry program, was there with the president last night. So you've got this bank robber who's now a Christian, and you have this FBI agent, and so they're telling the story. And Donald Trump tells the story. John's life is a beautiful testimony and testament to the power of redemption. He said not long ago he was saying, my life was running from the police, fearing the police, and avoiding the police due to the animosity I'd allowed to grow inside of me, because making me believe that they were the enemy. But today, praise God, I'm filled with hope, a proud American citizen who's been given a second chance. Well, in the midst of that, President Trump, you got to love him, says, I don't know that you're expecting this, but I'm going to grant you a pardon, and does so, and then holds up the document. So here, you talk about a story of redemption. I mean, it just couldn't be any better. And that one, unfortunately, wasn't well covered by the press or even by the broadcast last night, but it's a powerful story. There was another one. While we're talking about police, this one's Ryan Holitz, who is a New Mexico police officer who talks about meeting this woman who is engaged in heroin use, who is homeless, who is pregnant, and so as a result gets involved in her life and adopts her child. I mean, it's just an incredible story. Some of these you really almost have trouble not beginning to cry because I thought the production values were very well done. Talking about style versus substance for just a minute in terms of the Republican National Convention. And so then he says, I hold a special place in my heart for those facing opioid addiction, and that's why I'm enormously grateful to the president for his leadership in fighting this deadly enemy. Drug overdose deaths decreased in 2018 for the first time in 30 years. Sadly, as you've heard us talk about here, they've increased since then. But these were just some incredible stories, and they came from people that you probably did not know. While we're talking about that, Donald Trump not only gave a pardon, but he also had a naturalization ceremony there as well. Okay, that raises the Hatch Act. I'll get to that in just a minute, but let's at least give power in that regard, because on the first night you had Donald Trump holding a panel with some of the former hostages, and we talked about that yesterday. This one, he held a naturalization ceremony. And, of course, you know why he did this, because as we mentioned yesterday and the one last night, there has been an attempt to deal with some of the images that people have, right or wrong, about Donald Trump. One of those is he's racist, so you had a number of African Americans speaking last night and the night before. Number two, that he's anti-immigrant, and so if nothing else, that was an attempt to address that issue. And you, again, have never seen that before. That could be due to the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act is, of course, primarily to prevent people that are working in the government from being political. And there is an exemption to the president and the vice president. And frankly, I would play this safe that if Barack Obama had done a naturalization ceremony when he was in the White House, I would have said that would have been fine with me too. But of course, now they can say it maybe seems to violate at least the spirit of the law and maybe the letter of the law because you have the acting Secretary of Homeland Security there. So we will see how that plays itself out. Another individual that has been pretty much obscured and, again, one of those no names, but he became a big name, was Nick Sandmann. You might remember him. He was the high school student who wore the Make America Great hat when he was at the March for Life and found himself, of course, attacked by the media because they simply took a picture of him with this awkward smile because he was being in a sense, confronted by an individual that was trying to make an issue. And so the media portrayed him as having a smirk on his face and really just almost kind of destroyed him. And as a result, of course, he's been able to win a couple of lawsuits now. And as you might imagine, if you want to see how mean-spirited everybody is, instead of feeling sorry for a kid that just got caught up on all of this, you know, people making fun of his teeth, people saying, oh, he's going to be rich, he's going to get a political science degree and then work for a think tank, and instead of saying, this is a young man who was a lot more poised than I think I would have been at his age, who has been able to be facing the cancel culture before it was called the cancel culture and been able to survive that and did not go off and commit suicide. As a matter of fact, we talked about some other people have. And so, if nothing else, I thought that was another powerful piece. And if you notice so far, I haven't mentioned any political operatives, have I? I mean, just mentioned kind of just straight over people like you and me every day. Okay, let's mention two. If there is a rising star, for those of you in Kentucky, you know who I'm talking about. It's the first black attorney general of Kentucky. That is Daniel Cameron. I have been hearing about him. I saw an interview with him before he spoke last night, and pretty articulate, and if nothing else, dealing with the issue of some of the lawlessness, because, of course, in his particular state, one of those individuals that was killed has been an investigation. But nevertheless, just to read from him real quickly, he said, I was raised in Kentucky just a few miles from Abraham Lincoln's birthplace. Our first Republican president believed in compassion, self-reliance, freedom, equality, and justice. Sadly, there are some who don't believe in this wisdom or the better angels of our shared American history as they tear down statues of people like Ulysses S. Grant and even Mr. Lincoln himself. Then he went on to say that even as anarchists mindlessly tear up American cities while attacking police officers and innocent bystanders, we Republicans do recognize those who earnestly strive for peace, justice, and equality. Republicans will never turn a blind eye to unjust attacks, but neither will we accept an all-out assault on Western civilization. But he also, because he's African-American, had a chance to talk about a few other things. He said, Joe Biden is a backwards thinker in a world craving forward-looking leadership. There's no wisdom in his record or plan, just a trail of discredited ideas and offensive statements, which I think was probably the strongest statement he made. Joe Biden would destroy jobs, raise taxes, throw away lives of countless unborn children, and goes on through some of that. And then he talks about the idea that politics of identity and mob rule are not acceptable to me, and certainly the people that you yourselves need to pursue the American dream. And if nothing else, spends a little bit of time, of course, as you might have seen, talking about the fact that Joe Biden made some statements about African Americans and believing that skin culture should dictate your politics, and said, no, I have a mind of my own. But it was kind of an interesting, very powerful speech from somebody which some people said maybe he needs to be on a national ticket someday. 34 years of age, he's got some time to wait. And that brings us to the last one, which I'll just mention and we'll get to after the break, and that is the speech by the First Lady. I was not sure if she would be the keynote speech, but she was. And again, this was done in the Rose Garden. And that is also where the president will be speaking Thursday night. I know that for a fact because I know that Kelly Shackelford, who will be with us on Friday, has been invited to be one of the people speaking, actually sitting in the chair when the president gives that speech. So again, you have the president come in, pomp and ceremony and all the rest, and then she comes in, speaks about 25 minutes, then he comes up with her and they leave. And again, if you want to understand how mean-spirited people are, just look at some of the really nasty tweets that have been sent out about the First Lady. And you can understand kind of what we're up against in this political campaign. So we'll come back and talk about that, and also maybe do a comparison now that we have 2 nights from the Republican convention, 4 nights from the Democratic convention. Maybe talk about some of the differences between the two, and we'll talk about all that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes before the top of the hour. By the way, if you'd like to join us, and you can join us right now, or certainly when we come back at the top of the hour, because we'll have a little bit more to say about some other issues, not the least of which is what is happening in the cities, the burning of cities, as well as an issue that surfaced in the last couple of days about the idea of what the cities and the suburbs will do, because that's certainly an issue there as well. So we'll get into some of that. We'll talk a little bit about the election, and then before the next hour is up, we'll talk about the issue of addiction. But again, the First Lady, Melania Trump, talked a little bit about growing up, she says, as a young child in Slovenia, which was under communist rule at the time. I always heard about an amazing place called America, a land that stood for freedom and opportunity. As I grew older, it became my goal to move to the United States and follow my dream of working in the fashion industry, which is, of course, how she got here and how she eventually met Donald Trump. She then later on had sympathy with those who were dealing with the pandemic. She said, my deepest sympathy goes out to everyone who has lost a loved one, and my prayers are with those who are ill or suffering. I know many people are anxious and some feel helpless. I want you to know that you're not alone. My husband's administration will not stop fighting until there is an effective treatment or vaccine available to everyone. Then she talked a little bit about her husband, which is kind of what you are expecting Jill Biden to do, and that's what you're expecting Melania Trump to do. She said, no matter the amount of negative or false media headlines or attacks from the other side, Donald Trump has not and will not lose focus on you. He loves this country and he knows how to get things done. As you've learned over the past 5 years, he's not a traditional politician, she said. He doesn't just speak words, he demands action, he gets results. The future of our country has always been very important to him, and it is something that I've always admired. So some of the comments even admitted, he does speak his mind. It gets him in trouble, and you kind of hear that from individuals that will say that. But let me just mention before we move on to kind of the comparison, because that brings me to one of the articles we've posted on the website between the Democratic Convention, for which we, of course, have 4 days, and, of course, the Republican Convention, for which we have 1. But there were a couple of other things of note. One, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, did something that's never been done before. Again, this may get us back to the Hatch Act, and that is he gave his speech from Jerusalem. First of all, it's very rare. I mean, it's almost maybe unprecedented that a Secretary of State even speaks at a convention because, after all, again, in the State Department, you're not allowed to be political, so we'll have to see where that leads. For people that were looking at this from a Christian point of view, I would have to say you had a couple. You had, of course, Sissy Graham Lynch. She is the granddaughter of Billy Graham, or the daughter of Franklin Graham, speaking to this issue of religious liberty primarily. Of course, we have also Abby Johnson, the former Planned Parenthood staffer, who talked pretty bluntly about the issue of abortion, which I thought was very interesting that she did. Then, of course, you had the Vice President, Mike Pence, who actually did a broadcast from the Lincoln home in Indiana. You had Rand Paul, which was interesting because he talked about criminal justice, but also talked about the first time he met Donald Trump. He offered to pay for his medical missionary trip to Guatemala. You had a former Attorney General from Florida, Pam Bondi, and a number of others. But let's just get to one of the articles I've posted. This one was really kind of doing a comparison after the first day with by Molly Hemingway, who is the senior editor of The Federalist. And she points out a couple of things, and I'll just mention a few. And that is, first of all, she says the Democratic National Committee and its convention were not suffering because it was virtual. Because if anything, one of the puzzles to me, and I expressed that last night to some people around me, is the Democrats had everything going for them. They had celebrity host, they had celebrity appearances, they had basically anybody in Hollywood is probably going to support the Democrat Party. And yet, interestingly enough, I think the production values were much better and the pacing and interest was much better for these 2 nights in the Republican National Convention. And a lot of people said it might lead to a bump. But, of course, a bump is based on the assumption that people are watching it. I think, as best I can look at the numbers, more people watched the first night at the Republican Convention than the second night. And I think the second night might have been better than the first, although I've seen some people say the first one was better. So, you can live that down forever. But, again, one of the things that Molly Hemingway talks about is how, again, real people, she says, nearly stole the show. She talks about, for example, some others that I haven't mentioned tonight or today from last night, but from the previous night, and that would be like Andrew Pollock, who was the father of the daughter who was murdered at Parkland. Or many people think one of the best speeches came from Maximo Alvarez, who is a Florida businessman who described what it was like for his family to flee the communist systems that he grew up in on the way to the United States, and talked about this totalitarian movement and said, I'm speaking to you today because my family is done leaving places. There's nowhere left to go. And it may have been more powerful than some of the political speeches, so that was certainly the case. The other point that, again, Molly Hemingway makes is that when you're trying to do a cross-partisan outreach, that's where in the Democratic National Party and convention, you have a Republican say, I'm going to vote for Joe Biden, or when you have in the Republican convention a Democrat saying, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. It seemed to work better so far for the Republicans, in part because of who was picked. Because Molly Hemingway points out one of the people that spoke was Susan Molinari, who actually took her dad's seat in Congress, but is kind of best known as Google's top lobbyist, so not necessarily the best example. Another one, the former governor of New Jersey, Christine Todd Whitman, who never really was that close to the people in the Republican Party. She began to even start speaking against the Republican Party during the George W. Bush administration. So when you speak out against Donald Trump, it's like, okay, we've already heard that one before. And even when you look at somebody who actually had run in the Republican Party, John Kasich, former governor of Ohio, he left Congress to go work at Lehman Brothers. By contrast, look at, as she says here, Vernon Jones, who we mentioned last night, who is a Democrat in the Georgia State Legislature, African-American, who actually said he was going to support Donald Trump and talks about how so much criticism came to him. Or Kimberly Classic, who is the African-American woman running for Congress in Baltimore against Kwasi Mfume, I think is who she's running against, and again talked about how her city has a number of black Republicans running to improve the situation in the city. Or, of course, she also had, Tim Scott talking about Joe Biden as well. And so in some respects, you see some differences there. And then finally, one of the other pieces she points out is, okay, when you feel there is a criticism of Donald Trump, instead of ignoring it, they met it head on. And on Monday night, pretty obvious that many of the speakers were there to try to tamp down the argument that Donald Trump is a racist. And last night, pretty obvious that with the naturalization ceremony and a few others trying to tamp down the idea that he's anti-immigrant. And so if nothing else, kind of an interesting set of focus and perhaps a lot more focus on policy in the Republican 2 nights than in the 4 nights of the Democratic convention. But, of course, we have 2 more nights to go, not the least of which is the vice president will be speaking tonight from Fort McHenry, and we'll have a chance to hear from him. And then, of course, the president will be speaking Thursday night from the Rose Garden. So anyway, let's take a break. When we come back, I'm going to move away from the Republican National Convention. There's a lot more in the news to talk about, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This hour, I want to spend some time, first of all, talking about the cities on fire, something that has been steadfastly ignored by many of the Democrat leaders. And, you know, we've had this conversation off air, might as well have it on air. I don't understand why. I mean, this is one place where, whether you're Republican or Democrat, I think the statesmen in parties should come out and say, what is happening needs to stop. And there has been a steadfast unwillingness on those who oftentimes have a D next to their name to say anything about it, or to mischaracterize it, or in one or two cases even ignore it or pretend it didn't exist. And that is amazing to me. But nevertheless, that is the case. And it has been one of the arguments being used this week against why we shouldn't necessarily even have conventions, which I thought was kind of interesting. Robert Verbruggen, I guess I've never interviewed him, but I've quoted him before, and he made a great statement just the other day. He said, given our rising polarization, the political exhaustion of the past 4 outrage-soaked years, and the state of our country right now, with a pandemic ravaging both our health and our economy, and cities quite literally on fire, I can't help but to think we'd be better off getting our information about the election some other way, or maybe just playing video games instead. Anyway, he is entitled to his quote, and it comes from Jim Garrity, who oftentimes does a good job of summarizing that, to remind us that when you talk about cities on fire, that is literally true. Over the last 2 days, we have seen unbelievable amounts, well, actually 3 days now, 3 nights, riots and looting in Kenosha, Wisconsin, a city with less than 100,000 people. It's on the shore of Lake Michigan, if you're not familiar, and kind of between kind of Milwaukee and Chicago. Okay. And, of course, it's where the shooting took place. By the way, we're starting to learn a little bit more about that shooting to say, well, it looked like a bad shoot, probably still is, but there are some more facts to the conversation that are now surfacing, but not because the mainstream press is necessarily posting those videos, but others have been as well. But that being said, what you have is a conflict that has destroyed an enormous number of businesses, which are not just talking now about broken windows, but being set on fire. And again, the sad reality is that if you get all of your news from the so-called mainstream media, and that would be ABC, CBS, and NBC, or you even get it from just certain cable outlets, CNN or MSNBC, you might not even know that much about it. But let's just kind of go through a list here of the riots that have taken place, and I'll try to be complete. This list was put together by, again, Jim Garrity. I'll give him credit for it. But we've had riots in Atlanta, St. Louis, Seattle, New York City, Minneapolis, Chicago, Oakland, Denver, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Trenton, Atlantic City, Boston, Louisville, Kentucky, by the way, Bakersfield, California, Columbus, Ohio, Dallas, Des Moines, Detroit, Los Angeles, Sacramento, Phoenix, San Jose. And so obviously the one that has been in the news right lately has been Portland, which had I think they figured out 87 straight nights of protest. And, of course, Kenosha, 3 straight nights of protests and riots. And so you can see kind of where we are here. And one of the criticisms last night of the First Lady is that she mentioned looting. And so the commentator, and I'll leave his name off just to protect the innocent, I guess, or the guilty in this case, was, well, no, these are people protesting. Well, yes, there are people protesting. There are people rioting and looting. And if you haven't been paying attention to this, look at what has happened. We now have pretty good evidence of insurance companies that are now talking about raising the rates for insurance for businesses in any large city. Don't you think? I just gave you this long list of cities, and for those of you that are listening to this broadcast right now, and you live in a city, even if you haven't had the riots hit your city, you can see why the insurance companies are just kind of in shock right now because of the wave, or maybe could I use the word the tsunami of claims for damages. Sadly, of course, a lot of these businesses are destroyed by individuals that don't have insurance. But even those that do, you can begin to see that without warning, and Kenosha, Wisconsin is the best illustration. Who saw that coming? Nobody. But that one shooting is enough to have set forth 3 full nights of breaking windows, destroying property, burning some of the businesses to the ground. And the response, I'll give credit where credit is due, finally, from the Wisconsin governor, was if you're going to protest, please do it peacefully and safely. I'm sure all the rioters wrote that down and took care of that. And I thought it was kind of interesting that Emmanuel Cleaver, who is a representative from our listeners in Missouri, did, I think, remind us of something, and that is Martin Luther King Jr. never had a demonstration at night. Why? Because things get out of hand at night, and that's exactly what happened. So again, the situation is being argued that we can't trust Donald Trump because Donald Trump is a racist. Donald Trump is really dividing the nation. So now you're starting to have individuals that are saying, we need to have Joe Biden, the former vice president, go out there and give a unifying speech on race and to call for the rioters to actually tone down their rhetoric and for those to stop destroying resources. Don Lemon at CNN and others have said that. And so the argument that is being made is this happened on the watch of Donald Trump, and that's why we need somebody from the previous administration, preferably Joe Biden since he's running, or even Barack Obama since he's the former president, to do so. But again, my good friend Jim Garrity here, and again, I really don't know him that well, actually reminds us that, you know what, when Barack Obama was in office, we had, riots in Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore, Maryland, St. Paul, Minnesota. Remember for those of us living in Dallas, the shooting of 4 cops here in Dallas. All of that happened when Joe Biden was the vice president, Barack Obama was the president. So I'm not saying that there hasn't been an attempt to stoke the fires of division. And I'm not saying that the president hasn't sent out some tweets he shouldn't have sent out, probably. But the reality is that calling for peace probably isn't going to work, because even if the speech was given by Barack Obama or by Joe Biden, I just don't think the rioters are going to be listening. If anything, the core problem is not the rhetoric from the president. It's simply due to the fact that there are a number of individuals that are convinced that once they start smashing store windows, once they start stealing merchandise, once they start assaulting individuals and starting fires, they've already seen in the other cities that they can escape without any kind of consequences. And so where's the Justice Department in all of this? Where's the local police in all of this? Where are the governors in all of this? And fires are being set, and we are seeing them all over the country. Let's take a break, though. A lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
America is currently in the midst of a contentious debate about whether to open the public schools and how to do it. Parents, teachers, and administrators have concerns about the risks and safety. Those are legitimate concerns that need to be addressed. But what needs to be called out are the actions of some of the teachers' unions. For most of us, the pandemic represents a public health problem. For many of the teachers' unions, it provides an opportunity to leverage state legislatures and put charter schools out of business. The editors of the Wall Street Journal say there's a phrase for that: political extortion. Another commentator called it educational blackmail. Give it the label you feel most appropriate. It's not a good look for educators. The American Federation of Teachers declared their support for safety strikes if local unions didn't approve of steps used in school districts to address the virus. Earlier this month, an alliance of teachers unions and progressive groups sponsored a national day of resistance and listed their demands before returning to the classroom. Most of the demands have little to do with education and can't even be addressed by school boards. They range from canceling rents and mortgages to passing Medicare for all to passing a wealth tax. A few demands do relate to schools, like implementing a moratorium on voucher programs and standardized tests, along with moving towards police-free schools. These teachers' unions also want a moratorium on charter schools and want governors and other political leaders to also close private schools. Public schools are funded whether they're open or not. Private and religious schools rely on tuition and donations. Many of these teachers' unions seem less interested in finding ways to open schools safely and more interested in threatening strikes to get their progressive wish list. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you have ever been around me, you know that I do love the great outdoors. I love to fly fish, and I actually probably have left a fair amount of money at Cabela's and Bass Pro Shop and a number of others. And so I was heartened to see the other day that Tucker Carlson actually had Johnny Morris on the program, and that had to do with the case against Alaska's Pebble Mine. Now, if you get various mailings from environmental groups, and I get some from various trout groups and things of that nature, a lot of people have been very concerned about this mine that was going to be actually proposed in Alaska. And the latest evidence is that the administration has been trying to block it, and environmental groups have been encouraging that. And if you find yourself, well, say, why should I care about a mine, and how does that relate to fish? It has to do with the fact that probably the world's largest salmon fishery is right there in Bristol Bay. And so a lot of people have said we can't afford to actually mine copper and gold and risk the possibility of ruining that fishery. And so there's been a lot of back and forth, claims back and forth. I've, of course, noticed some of the things that have been posted by the senators in Alaska. But the way it's been kind of pushed up until now is the Army Corps of Engineers have said they've had some technical issues with this, and actually to anticipate the president opposing it. That may actually show up in this convention. We'll see where it goes. But again, the mine would be built near the headwaters of Bristol Bay, which actually is probably the world's biggest sockeye fishery in the world. It provides about 11% of all the wild salmon harvest. And if you've ever seen some of the videos, just incredible stuff to see. And a lot of people thought the Trump administration would go along with it. And then all of a sudden, Donald Trump signed what was called the Great American Outdoors Act, which secured about $1 billion a year for conservation work. And interestingly enough, Trump said there hasn't been anything like this since Teddy Roosevelt, I suspect. Later on in the day, his son, Donald Trump Jr., raised the issue of the mine project and some of the rest. But nevertheless, we'll see where that goes. And I thought it was kind of interesting because Tucker Carlson, who apparently likes to fish as well, had the actual head of Bass Pro Shop, that's Johnny Morris, in a segment called The Case Against Alaska's Pebble Mine. And I thought it was interesting that Johnny Morris, in the midst of that, also quoted from Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt, who Trump had just called the truly great conservation president, and who actually was, of course, on Mount Rushmore. So, nevertheless, I just thought I might mention that in passing, something we'll keep paying attention to. But if you're concerned about conservation and about our nation's fisheries, that has certainly been in the news. One other thing that I thought I might bring up real quickly has to do, and this, I hope I don't get into the weeds too much, but it relates to something that was said Monday night and has been brought up again, and that is the argument that if indeed Barack Obama and Joe Biden have their way, we would eventually eliminate the suburbs as we know it. Now, to understand that, let me just simply go to Robert Knight, who I think did a very good job of summarizing the fact that he says that President Trump caused a stir back in July when he issued an order terminating one of these housing policies, which he believed, that is, Robert Knight believes, would be killing off the suburbs. And the particular column that appeared in the Wall Street Journal was written by Donald Trump, and also by the Housing and Urban Development Secretary, Dr. Ben Carson. And I'm just going to quote from them. The Democrat plan is to remake the suburbs in their image so they can resemble the dysfunctional cities they now govern. As usual, anyone who dares tell the truth about what the left is doing is smeared as a racist, which is one of the reasons why I think Donald Trump decided to have the co-author of the piece, the op-ed piece, be Ben Carson. It didn't matter. They called them both racist. But nevertheless, what is the issue? It has to do with under the Barack Obama administration, they had what was called Affirmative Furthering Fair Housing, AFFH. And what it would do, according to the president and according to some of the evidence in it, would be to abolish single-family zoning and compel the construction of high-density, what many people call stack and pack apartment buildings in residential neighborhoods, and transform those neighborhoods. Now, the argument that has been made by people against it is that at least can we require that some of maybe Section 8 housing, high-density housing, stay in certain areas, but when you start moving them out into the suburbs, first of all, that's going to affect not only people's property values, but it's also going to affect the issues of danger. One of the things that Robert Knight points out is once thriving cities have huge areas where it's not safe to go even in the daytime. And so you can see that some of these district attorneys, he says, that have been elected and financed by George Soros have abandoned what he called the broken windows method of curbing crime. And we can, of course, see the implications of that. Of course, we've also seen Black Lives Matter mobs go into some of the suburbs, even go into some of the other areas. And so there have been a number of people that have been very concerned about this particular piece of legislation. Well, again, you don't have to trust even what Robert Knight has to say. One of the individuals we've interviewed over the years, and I quote quite often in one of my books, Stanley Kurtz, points out that it will be, if these particular laws are implemented, a situation with American suburbs will be swallowed up by the cities they surround. And he says they will lose control of their own zoning. and development, they'll be pressured into kind of a de facto regional revenue redistribution, and that even be forced to start building high-density, low-income housing. And so the question that a lot of people are asking is this going to be something you want to do nationwide? Because we've seen the impact of this in two different cities. Let's pick both of those before we take a break. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, there we are, back to Minneapolis again, the city council decided to not only disband the police department, which we've talked about, but it became the first city to ban zoning for single-family homes. It was the landmark 2040 comprehensive plan, and the impact that could have on suburbs is fairly devastating. But it's not the only place where that's happened. It's also happened in the state of Oregon. We're now bound to Portland. Banned in the state of Oregon single-family zoning in cities with more than 10,000 residents. And, of course, you also, for our listeners in California, have a bill that's pending, which would require California cities and counties to permit duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes on residential land zoned for single-family homes. I hope it wasn't too technical, but you can begin to see why the other day when you had the testimony that came from, I think, two Democrat lawyers who were actually cited for a felony for brandishing those weapons in St. Louis, why in the midst of their talking about the Second Amendment or talking about protecting their homes, they also express their concern about what might be happening in the suburbs. And it goes back to this particular issue that I think is going to surface more and more in the future. Just a few minutes, we're going to talk about the issue of hope for the age of addiction, but I thought I'd just mention something that we will come back to on Friday. Kelly Shackelford pointed this out the other day. He'd heard John Fund, who we'd like to get on the program, talking about the fact that when we had the coronavirus and the pandemic, there have been a number of people that have wanted to vote by mail rather than in person. But the bigger issue, which I had never even thought about, is the fact that, as John Fund points out, a lot of the volunteers, a lot of the poll workers, that's about 900,000 poll workers, are much older. Matter of fact, 58% of them, back a couple of years ago, were 61 years of age or older, and they're less likely to show up and work the polls this November. So we are starting to see a vanishing core of volunteers to actually work the polls, and that's going to be really a very significant issue. Now, some have been trying to address that. One is a conservative group called the Leadership Institute. I've interviewed them before, really trying to train, they hope, 100,000 young people on not only how to run for office, but how to work on campaigns and to at least get some of them to work the polls. Because we may have an unbelievable shortage in poll workers, which means we could have even longer lines and even more possibility of voter fraud if you don't have people watching the vote. So it's another issue we'll come back to on Friday, because Kelly Shackelford is the first one to kind of alert me to that. And a very good piece that just came out by John Fund, who was the first one to kind of alert all of us to this very important issue. Let's take a break, though. I've covered a lot of issues, but let's finish off this last half hour by talking about, is there hope for addiction? A topic the First Lady addressed last night, and we will address next, right after these issues.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour, we're going to spend some time talking about addiction. That was something that, of course, was addressed even last night by the First Lady, and it is something we've talked about so often here on the program. New book that has just come out earlier this month, Hope in the Age of Addiction, How to Find Freedom and Restore Your Relationships. Chip Dodd and Stephen James are the authors of that book, and it is going to help you understand a little bit more about the age of addiction, the cycle of addiction, maybe 5 tools to address that. And Stephen James is the founder and executive director of the Sage Hill Counseling Program in Nashville, and also is an author of a number of best-selling books, including Parenting with Heart with Chip Dodd, and he joins us now by phone. So, Stephen, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kirby. I'm so glad to spend a few minutes with you.
Well, in these few minutes, let's, if we can, talk about the extent of this addiction. It has been something that has always been a problem, which seems to have been made worse by the pandemic. I thought it was kind of interesting. You've got a chapter here on trying to describe and define pandemic. I think everybody's sort of figured that one out by now, because I suspect this was written before the pandemic. But we have on this program talked about the deaths of despair increasing, the number of drug overdose deaths that have increased. And so a problem that has always been with us has been made worse by the pandemic, hasn't it?
It certainly has. And, and the fear that's being fueled in our country right now, and the disconnection we're feeling and division we're in, it all adds to it, right? So all that is kind of coming together to people that are sensitive and prone to addiction are relapsing. It's getting worse. Suicidal attempts are going up. Opioid abuse this year is up 14% year to date over last year. Opioid deaths, in America.
Mm-hmm.
So what was already a giant problem last year, we have forgotten about, and is continuing to get worse. And we could solve that today. Unlike COVID-19, we could actually solve much of the opioid crisis today, but we're not going to. That's sad for me.
It is. And again, you're bringing a biblical perspective here as well. It is published by Revell, and the book came out earlier this month, so it should be easy to find in your local bookstore. But if not, we have a link to it both in paperback and Kindle. And a number of chapters, 10 chapters, a section on the age of addiction, and then a section on understanding addiction, and then finally a path, not a pill. And Stephen, one of the things I thought we might focus on is each chapter has some great facts and figures, but then you have a story of Greg or Rachel or Mark or Nate or whoever it might be. And in some respects, that is put there to give people hope, because if you're in the midst of addiction, or you have a child or a parent or a grandparent or a colleague or someone like that addicted, sometimes you're just looking for hope, aren't you?
I think one of the things addiction does primarily, and it's kind of middle and latter stages, is rob us of the hopes that life could be better, right? And it becomes our God, whether we mean it to or not. And we write in the book about how no one woke up one morning and said, 3 years from now, I'm going to get a DUI and lose my job and get divorced and lose custody of my children. They don't make that decision. They make a decision to feel better for a moment, right? But in time, they end up losing hope, and the addiction takes the place, becomes the center of their life. And it robs them of hope and promises them relief in the short term,
For a lot of people listening,
devastating.
they're probably struggling with the fact that it's probably their kids. You have a whole section here on children of addiction. Of course, there's some addicts listening right now, or even former addicts that have maybe been cured. So in some respects, it's really important to give that sense of hope, because you just are convinced that there is maybe no way out. And given the fact that a lot of them are, as you talk about in this book, in a state of denial, they don't necessarily believe they're addicted in the first place.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the stories, and that's, we open the book with 2 letters, a letter to the addict and a letter to the person who loves the addict, right? And this book is so much about offering encouragement and that there is an opportunity to heal. And that's why the stories of real life people, these aren't clinical vignettes written by 2 psychologists. These are real life people that all wanted to put their real names in the book, but liability issues and
even the culture we live in around that. The publisher decided it's safer for everybody involved to not put their real names, but they're real life people who've made it through alcohol or drugs or sex addiction or codependency or gambling or, like really difficult situations. And these are wonderful people. We've got doctors and pastors and moms and like just great people, right? That found themselves trapped in the clutches of this vicious beast.
Wow.
And made it out. And so really, in the end, when you do a word count, most of the book is encouragement and hope. And then there's some helpful things that Chip and I write with that are practical, but we really wanted people to know that it's possible to live without being in the clutches of this thing.
Hope in the Age of Addiction, and again, is published by Revell. Let's talk about what is addiction and the addictive cycle, because I thought it was kind of interesting. There's a section here, Am I an Addict? I mean, I guess the fact is some people don't realize that they are actually addicted, or they didn't know really how they got there in the first place.
Yeah, I would say actually that there's only, broadly, there's a small category that doesn't fit this, but broadly there's two types of people. There's those of us who are living free, and there's those of us who are still enslaved, right? And sadly, just having faith and believing in Christ and doesn't keep you from addiction. Like there are lots of truly honest, believing Christians who are trapped in addiction, and so to have a chapter where we create an inventory of questions and that help people look at things. From alcohol and pornography, which we all know about, and illicit drugs and nicotine, but also like computers and video games and social media. And I just got back from a trip out west with 12, I do a lot of leadership consulting, so 12 business owners, and we took their phones for 4 days, right, on the trip. And every one of these gentlemen said they could feel their pocket vibrating on their leg, even though they didn't have a cell phone. That's addiction, right? That's a physiological fabrication of reality, because they're so used to it, right? And how we end up defining addiction is a impaired relationship with a mood altering substance or behavior. So it's something that makes me sick, that no matter how hard I try to stop, I can't stop it, and it ends up trying to kill me. That thing that ends up trying to kill me. So, we have relationships with overworking, with exercise, with pain seeking and cutting and shopping and sleep, and
Yes.
Plastic surgery is like a real thing. Plastic surgery addiction. And so we try to expand the definition from the things that are most judged and obvious to the things that are most subtle in our life that we even are maybe in denial of. Our people-pleasing behaviors, and try to paint a picture for how you can walk through that.
Let me just mention, too, we have a link to sagehill.co, and so you can find some of the information there about the counseling organization you work with. And one of the things is a video on how to manage anxiety. And when I look at your addiction cycle, anxiety leads to control, preoccupation, sometimes a self-cure, repetition. So there is a sense in which individuals are trying to get off of that cycle, and yet in some respects, it just comes back again, what I guess you could call a feedback loop. Can you speak to that?
It is. Yeah, it's a negative feedback loop. So, we all go through life, and any of us that are old enough to remember anything know that life is painful, right? And the way our brains are created is we start looking out for painful things. And so when we go through a life event that we suspect might lead us to shame or rejection or humiliation or abandonment or even physical pain, our brain is made to look for relief, and that's called anxiety, is the prediction of negative outcomes. So one bad thing happens, and I then start to predict that something else bad is going to happen. And so then in order to get away from that, I look for things to control, my life so that bad things don't happen. And I become preoccupied with those things, right? And then that gets so stressful of having to try to stay in control of a life that's uncontrollable that I then look for relief. And anything that moves us from distress, specifically terror and humiliation or shame and fear, moves us from those states to relief or a sense of well-being, our organ of the brain will say, yes, I like that. I want more of that, whether it's good for us or not, right? And so that's where we say addiction's not a moral failure. It's actually a deep desire, craving to find relief in a broken world.
Right.
And
let's take a break and
killing us.
Yeah, let's come back and talk about that. And especially, we want to focus on 5 tools to really deal with this. And we'll talk about that right after these messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Stephen James with us for a few more minutes, co-author of this new book, Hope in the Age of Addiction. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have information about it so you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. How to find freedom and restore your relationships. And we've talked about, if nothing else, the cycle of addiction. Let's talk about the path to freedom. You talk about 5 tools, and in some respects, the goal of the book, actually, Stephen, is to provide hope. So give us some hope. How can we do that?
And I'm going to do the thing and boil down a really significant problem into 5 steps, which is we write in the book, this whole section is called a path, not a pill. So These are the steps, but this is a path you end up walking, not an easy fix solution that you take, right? And so that's my caveat. But the 5 things we talk about are admission, abstinence, surrender, acceptance, and struggle. To begin to find healing and freedom from addiction, you have to, admit that you need help, admit that you have a problem, right? And admit that the things you've tried to get out of the problem haven't worked. Right? That is actually the beginning. For every addict I've ever worked with in my over 20 years now in this field, I've never seen one get well unless they've tried to get well on their own first. And then they don't, and then they start to look for help, and they find out that they can't get well on their own. They have to get well in relationship with other people. And so admission is the beginning, and then abstinence is a huge part of it, that you have to stop the thing you're doing in order to begin to heal from the damage it's created from you. So physiologically, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually, abstinence is a massive part of healing from addiction. Our brains need to create new neural pathways, and it can't unless we're not using that substance. Psychologically, we need to be able to see ourselves in a different way and experience life in a different way. We can't if we're mood altered. Emotionally, really what addiction is at the core is an inability or unwillingness to feel our feelings, to tolerate negative or vulnerable emotions like anger or shame or fear. So emotionally, sobriety or abstinence allows us to begin to have resiliency and deal with negative emotions. And then spiritually, the other cornerstone of this is abstinence allows us to begin to put God back in the right place, and as our cravings cease and we begin to heal, we begin to see that we need a God that can do more for us than we can ask or imagine, right? And so after that, then the work of surrendering our will over to a God that can do more for us than we can ask or imagine, like to give back. The word surrender means to give back over. Mm-hmm. So just to re-give our hearts back to the God that made us and loves us is a way to begin to heal even further and to accept that we don't have control. So acceptance becomes the next thing, is that life is tragic, is one of the truths that we espouse, and that God is faithful. And the paradox that we live in, between Eden, east of Eden and west of glory, right, is this paradox that we live in a very painful world and that God is real and creating and loving in the midst of that pain. And that learning to live in acceptance of that, is part of what leads us to the fifth step, which is called struggle. And so much of life is what to be faithful means, to struggle in life and to depend on relationship and God and community and lack of control and those, like the bigger truths than our own solutions, right? To surrender to that and struggle in that. And we talk about the truth in the book that it takes a lifetime to learn how to live, right? And
sure,
we're not the same. I'm 47, and I sure hope I'm a mature, wiser, more seasoned man at 70, but there's going to be struggle that comes along the way. So a lot of addiction recovery after abstinence and after learning some basic tools is learning how to struggle well with yourself, with others, and with God. And that's a lifetime work.
Just before we go, your last chapter, the paradigm of sickness and recovery, you've got a diagram there, which I've never seen before. And then I looked at it and said, well, that's because it was developed by your co-author, Chip Dodd. But I thought it was really good. The way of sickness in one direction, the way of freedom in another. That's reason to get the book alone just to see the diagram. We'll hold it up for people watching there, but it looks kind of like, if nothing else, an hourglass. But it helps you understand. It helps you understand that when you start with self, and you go one direction, it gets into codependency, toxic shame, addiction. If you go the other direction and get recovery, healthy shame, eventually you come back to healing. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's actually a kind of a paradoxical model that we had to go over and over with the publisher for them to understand what we were talking about. But when we teach it, people get it. So we come into life of self, right? One of God's gifts to us is that we are a person, right? We have a sense of autonomy even as a child, but we're made for relationship. So what happens is we experience pain in life, and because humans are made for relationship, when we experience pain, we equate that something must be wrong with me for experiencing this pain. So trauma and abandonment equal pain. And so then I decide I've got to be better at being myself. That's toxic shame. I've got to become a different person in order to be loved and accepted, which leads to codependency, which says I'm not okay unless you're okay. And that's so exhausting, trying to make the world around me okay, my children, my spouse, my friends, trying to make them emotionally sound so that I'll be okay is exhausting. So I turn to other things called addictions to give me a break. The solution is actually to return to how we're made as emotional and spiritual creatures, to actually have a bigger self, because addiction is trying to get away from how we're made. It's trying to get away from how God created us. So when we return to having a big self at the bottom, you have a big self, then you have lots of feelings, you have lots of needs, and then you very quickly run out of your own solutions, and you need something bigger than yourself, right? And so you move towards healing. Your shame gets transformed from toxic shame to healthy shame, which shame is a wonderful emotion. Without shame, none of us will wear clothes. And in psychology, the definition of a shameless person is a psychopath, right? So shame's a good thing. It allows us to get along in a relationship. But it's so powerful, we overuse it. So we need to transform it to healthy shame. We recover from codependency, and our need for mood-altering behaviors becomes really small because we begin to trust that God made me, while I'm deficient, like I don't have all the answers, that God made me his crowning achievement in glory, made a little bit less than himself. I'm above the angels and all creation. I as a human being, am God's crowning jewel in all of his creation. But I real quickly need other things than me, right? And so that return to how we're made as emotional and spiritual creatures actually leads us to live beyond ourselves in service to the greater world, and into giving our lives away for something greater than our own safety and security, right? So, but it starts with a return to self. So it's kind of a paradox, but I think that path is really helpful to explain how we get back to who we are and return to our God-bestowed gifts.
Again, it is part of the book. Chip Dodd and Stephen James, who've been with us, talking about the book, Hope in the Age of Addiction, How to Find Freedom and Restore Your Relationships. It is now out, so you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. Dan Allender's been on the program with us, endorses it, along with many other people that you would appreciate. As I said before, 10 chapters, lots of stories of hope. Matter of fact, more hope than anything in the book. And it is published by Revell, so you should be looking for it in a local bookstore, but if not, we have a link to it, both in paperback and Kindle. And again, if you want to know more about some of the work that Stephen James is doing at the Sage Hill Counseling Center there in Nashville, you have that link there as well. So, Stephen, thank you for joining us and giving us some time today to provide some hope in this age of addiction. So thank you for joining us.
Kirby, thank you so much for having me on. Blessings to you.
And we are simply out of time. So let me just mention that the third night of the Republican National Convention is tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk about that. Got Larry Crabb on tomorrow, so we'll be hearing from him too, and a variety of other individuals that you need to hear from, but we'll cover some of that, and we'll continue to do things that will help your faith, your family, and your freedom. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.